Which brings me to my coming out to my old man. He gets his own video because I think a lot of gay and straight men in particular really struggle to get out from under their father's disapproval and shadow. And perhaps my story will strike a chord with some of you. Fair warning, if you're fortunate enough to have or have had an affectionate, loving and sympathetic father or father figure in your life, you are likely going to find it very difficult to imagine the circumstances that would precipitate the need to perform closure to your relationship with your dad while he's still alive. But once again, I would warn that you not project your own sentimental feelings and familial sensitivities onto me. If your dad was your hero, I'm genuinely happy for you. But please be respectful of the fact that not all of us are as lucky. Now, my dad, despite his many flaws, was not a monster. Even though I was not his biological son, he actually did his level best to be a good father to me. I genuinely believe that. There were many kindnesses and generosities that I will always remember and be grateful for. But it would be disingenuous of me to not add on to that the fact that I feel like he ultimately failed me as a parent. I mean no ingratitude by being honest about our relationship. In fact, I've always taken pains not to unpack my troubled relationship with my dad in great detail because, well, dead people can't defend themselves, can they? But I think that I would be doing an enormous disservice to all the people who might be watching this if I was anything less than brutally honest about the night my dad critically and quite spectacularly misjudged what a formidable firebrand I had grown into by my mid-20s. At that stage of my young adulthood, I was supremely comfortable with my sexuality and proudly out to all my friends and immediate family. My dad was the only one deliberately kept in the dark for his own good, frankly. The man was too old school and stuck in a bygone era in thinking. By then, I was back to living in Durban, and my dad was still living in Johannesburg, so I didn't see any pressing need to come out to him. Besides, ours was not exactly a warm and fuzzy, intimate father-son relationship, despite my best efforts. Dad was an emotionally distant, uncommunicative, and stubbornly proud man who chose not to see me as my own person, but as an extension of his own identity. I'm sure there are many of you out there who will relate. I mean, men like that of that generation in particular are so run-of-the-mill and predictable, they're practically a tired movie cliche at this point. Nevertheless, my dad's approval and rare affections had always been like oxygen to me as a child, and he knew it. As a little boy, I was the apple of his eye, but as my character, tastes, and personality started to emerge, he didn't like what he saw. He had this predetermined idea of performative masculinity lifted straight from the movies and TV that I failed to conform to in his eyes. For example, he would often berate me for being artistic and for not playing more sports. This from a guy who never once threw a ball in the backyard with his son, so there's that. And though I really enjoyed swimming, cycling, and cricket, I was also deeply inspired by the performing and visual arts. But he scoffed at such girlish and self-indulgent pursuits. Part of my dad's passive-aggressive / autocratic parenting style was to make his displeasure over something I had done or not done painfully obvious to me by giving me the cold shoulder or the silent treatment. Then I'd make the tiniest of slip-ups and he would just explode with an anger that was disproportionate to the slightness of my mistake. It instilled such anxiety and dread in me as a little child because I didn't know how to avoid displeasing him without the benefit of knowing what I'd done wrong in the first place. I was like, talk to me, tell me what I've done wrong. If you don't tell me, I can't know it. I'm not a freaking mind reader. Although, towards the end of our relationship, I'd become a rather brilliant telepath. My dad would also withhold validation when I did excel at something, and I can still vividly remember the countless times I tortuously twisted myself into a series of emotional knots and pretzels, trying futilely to win his favor and approval. But nothing I ever did or achieved seemed good enough for the man. It's an all too familiar story for a lot of us, sadly. Like I said, parents like that are a walking fucking cliche. I remember when I first got really famous, I was so sure my dad would be proud to see the Varga name, his family name, up in lights on TV screens, in newspapers, and on magazine covers. Dad and I were the only Vargas in South Africa after all. But of course, to acknowledge any pride or gratification would mean giving me the satisfaction of knowing that I had done something right finally. And we can't have that, no sir. But I think that for most men, regardless of sexual orientation, there comes a time in their journey towards maturity and manhood when they begin to recognize the vulnerability and fallibility of their fathers. My dad had always preached such a high-minded message of lofty principles and honorable conduct. As a little boy, I looked up to him as a towering icon and a gentleman of absolute integrity. But as the years wore on and I matured, I came to discern his glaring shortcomings and failings. When I wisened up to his power play of withholding approval to make a cheap point or maintain some kind of hold or influence over me, I grew really tired of all his childish, passive-aggressive games and made a conscious decision to divest him of any and all influence he had once had over me. Putting it simply, I just stopped bothering to prove myself to the old man. And in any case, I was getting on with things and thriving in both my career and personal life, so his opinion of me was utterly irrelevant by this point. Now, by my early 20s, I was ready for a serious relationship, but I found South African gay men, particularly of my age, to be flaky and somewhat lacking in the maturity and emotional depth departments. So the men who excited me were invariably foreign, older, or more seasoned. Though to be clear, I never had daddy issues of the romantic or sexual kind. I was, however, about to have daddy issues of the actual kind, because one day, quite out of nowhere, my dad announced that he would be visiting Durban, especially to meet up with me for a long overdue father-son, man-to-man chat. I instinctively knew what that was subtext for and braced myself for what I suspected was going to be a showdown. My partner at the time was a wonderful man I was so sure I was going to spend the rest of my life with. In fact, he proposed to me a couple of years into our romance, but thanks to my own family's shitty track record in that regard, I was wary of the heteronormative model of marriage, so I demurred because I didn't want to jinx our relationship. I don't wish to kiss and tell, so I'm going to call my ex James, like James Bond of the Pierce Brosnan flavor, because he was this tall, dark, and handsome British gentleman with an impeccable sense of style and a worldliness that I had not encountered in other gay men before, and the first time I laid eyes on him, I knew it was fate and that he was the one. But it wasn't just love or lust at first sight. James and I were kindred spirits. Our energies crackled and aligned. It was really special. In fact, James was my first great love and long-term relationship. We made a home and built a life together that lasted 5 mostly blissful years, and although we didn't make it in the end, I have absolutely no regrets. I'll always be grateful to him for the gift of his love, generosity, and guidance. By the way, fun fact, when you love someone, I mean genuinely love someone, you never stop loving them. Love is a selfless, unconditional thing. Even after the relationship ends, no matter how badly, that deep affection, tenderness, and concern for the other person's well-being and happiness stays with you always. And that's a beautiful thing. It warms my heart to know that James is healthy and today happily married to a man who loves him. Now, my dad had met James a few times and knew that he and I were living together at this point, but because he was aware that James had been married to a woman and was now a divorcee, my dad just assumed he was straight. Further jamming my dad's gaydar was the fact that James was also the CEO of the South African division of a global corporation. Because according to the myths and stereotypes my dad had been fed, James couldn't possibly be a savvy businessman and a titan of industry and be gay at the same time. To him, the natural habitat for gay men was a hair salon, not a corporate boardroom. As a matter of fact, my dad actually admired James for his stature and success and thought that he would be a quote-unquote good influence on me. He had simply assumed that our living arrangements were as a result of James taking me under his wing out of the kindness of his heart, as a sort of benevolent mentor figure, and that we were merely flatmates and friends. And I let him believe that, again, for his own good. But the moment of truth had now found me, and it was time to face it the only way I knew how, head on. My hippocampus and I vividly remember every single word that was uttered that fateful night of our meeting like it was yesterday. Spoiler alert, it did not go well. I went to meet my dad at the apartment of one of his friends where he was staying, and fortunately it was just the two of us, given how disastrously things went down that night. Once we got past all the pleasantries and sat down face to face, my dad prefaced his man-to-man with a reminder that he loved me no matter what and that my happiness was his happiness, quote unquote. Growing up, he had always given me this touching speech, and I had always taken him at his word. But now the hour had come to test the veracity of his noble and high-minded claim. I thanked my dad for the sentiments and told him how much I appreciated his unconditional love and selflessness. Judging by the way he's taken the trouble to set this up, this may actually end up going well, I briefly thought to myself. Then my father took a deep breath and began with this straight to the point, man-to-man, no-nonsense doozy. So, do you not like women? That was his opening salvo. I thought, geez, Dad, what are you, 12? Oi, this is going to be awkward and painful. Of course I like women, Dad, I replied. Yes, but do you like women that way? He ventured further. And exactly what way is that? I inquired, now admittedly in a patronizing tone. You know, that way, he labored on, eyebrows winking. Of course, I knew exactly what he meant, but I was being deliberately facetious and disingenuous because I felt that if my father was going to have the temerity to summon me for a no-holds-barred man-to-man to confront me about whether I was gay, I wanted him to at least bring himself to actually say the G word out loud. He couldn't, or rather wouldn't, but then this was a man who couldn't bring himself to have the birds and the bees conversation with his only son when he came of age, so maybe I was setting the bar just a teensy bit too high. Anyway, I began to see how this juvenile line of questioning was eventually going to annoy the crap out of me, so I thought, fuck it, let's just get this over with. Look, Dad, if what you're trying to ask me is, am I gay? Then the answer is yes, I said confidently and assertively. A long, deafening silence ensued. My dad's face seemed frozen in a deadpan expression for what felt like ages, but then he furrowed his brow and looked quizzical and almost pained as he asked, in the most endearingly earnest and sincere way, his first follow-up question. Does James know? Have you had a moment in the middle of a tense situation when you have to make a split-second calculation about whether you should meet the moment with all the sobriety and seriousness it demands, or give in to the overwhelmingly natural urge to break with an uncontrollable burst of laughter, followed by the witty one-liner that immediately pops into your head? It took every ounce of self-restraint I could muster in that moment not to come back with, well, Dad, I guess you could say something tipped him off to it. But I could sense that this wasn't a moment for levity, and since Vargas Sr. was not renowned for his bawdy sense of humor, I muzzled my laugh and joke and slowly and patiently gay-splained that James was in fact not just my friend and roomie, but also my lover, and that we were both deeply in love and oh so very happy together. The look of horror and raised eyebrows consternation on my dad's face was a foreboding of what was to come, because what followed could best be described as the stuff of parody. I mean, it was an utterly unoriginal copy-paste of every mawkish and cliched script line of dialogue from every awful movie or TV melodrama throughout the ages in which the parents of the gay protagonist lose their shit upon discovering that their kid is gay. Cue the first stage, invalidation and denial. How do you know you're gay? This must be a phase. You're just confused. And in any case, no son of mine is going to be gay. And then the Inquisition and ignominy. What did we do wrong? What will people say? You're sick. Aren't you ashamed? You should be. How could you do this to us? How could you be so selfish? How will I face people now that my son is a muffy? And let's just stick a pin in those last three for later, please. And finally, the death blow. Disassociation and damnation. If that's how you want to behave, I'm cutting you out of my life. I'm disowning you. I never want to see your face again. You're dead to me. I have no son. Well, I thought that escalated quickly. Whatever happened to I love you no matter what, and your happiness is my happiness? I'm laughing about it now, but it was all terribly serious in the moment. Even as my dad paced around the room in his fit of temper, I remained seated and purposefully composed and quiet throughout his entire meltdown, and only after I had gathered that my dad had exhausted his arsenal of vitriol and scorn and ran out of emotional blackmail and abuse to hurl at me, I slowly rose up to directly meet his eye and calmly responded with, "Dad, I accept your terms." I even reached out my hand to shake his like the gentleman that I am, but he wouldn't accept it. In fact, he looked rather confused and most unsatisfied for someone who had taken a self-righteous stand and let off steam from a good rant. And that's when things got really ugly. In a nutshell, his strategy or plan or whatever the fuck that whiny bitch fit was had backfired. I had clearly called his bluff, and when he realized that I wasn't about to be cowed or intimidated in any way by his condemnation, he started to become desperate and quite hysterical. First, he threatened to take his own life in the most maudlin and theatrical fashion with loads of fretful gesticulating. I mean, and the straights have the nerve to call us drama queens. This self-pity party word salad went on for about 10 minutes and was chock full of more tortuous movie dialogue nuggets and cliches that I won't subject you to. This is what happens when you watch too many Bollywood movies, folks. But in all of his histrionics, I was so struck by how he had managed to make my coming out all about himself. Again, stick a pin in that for later. Anyway, my dad could tell from the look on my face that I wasn't having any of it, and that he was clearly losing this battle of wills, so he needed to change it up to something more extreme. And that's when he turned to me and crossed the line over to a very dark place. His expression turned sinister as he proceeded to threaten grievous harm to James to my face. At first, I thought this was just empty bluster uttered in the heat of the moment, but I could see the gears turning in his head. He looked like he was actually plotting it. Now, my father was not a violent man, but it occurred to me in that moment that he was pally with some very nefarious, thuggish and leg-breaker type men who would be equal to the task. In the cinema distribution business, you always need some burly bouncers and heavies around to escort expensive film prints through dodgy neighborhoods. And of course, my dad knew where James and I lived. I had, up until that very moment, managed to remain calm and able to contain my deep disappointment, though not surprised, over the fact that a man I loved and had always looked up to had just exposed himself as a liar and a fraud with all his bullshit moral preening and virtue signaling about loving me unconditionally. But this was bordering on psychopathy. And that's when an unspeakable, clean-burning anger and righteous rage suddenly welled up inside of me, and I fucking lost it. My father's face suddenly looked unrecognizable and repugnant to me. In his, I saw the smug mug of every snot-nosed punk and cretinous ruffian who had ever bullied and beat up on me when I was growing up. I expected the cruelty and hate from them, but not from my own father. Honestly, I was so enraged and disgusted with my dad at this point that I thought I was actually going to put my fist through his now smirking, self-satisfied face. One of the many benefits of having signed up for 13 years of rigorous speech and elocution training is that you master the art of booming your voice with enormous force and timbre by harnessing what's known as intercostal diaphragmatic breathing to power up all your resonating chambers so you can really project your voice without having to resort to shouting. I'll spare you and this microphone a demonstration, but I summoned all of my newfound anger and the might of my vocal training and loudly bellowed at my father, "You will do nothing of the sort." My voice was so thunderous, I think the walls and the windows of the apartment actually shook, and my father looked visibly stunned. I continued at full tilt. "Since you've now disowned and formally washed your hands off of me and my life, it is now neither your place nor your right to have a say in either. Is that clear? Is that fucking clear? Just who the hell do you think you are?" "I'm your father," he responded feebly, clearly taken off guard by my adversarial posture and profane language. "Then act like it," I snapped back. I had never dared to raise my voice with my dad, much less swore at him before, and he was clearly caught on the back foot. My voice bristled with such contempt and disgust as I continued. You have the gall to show up here with all your bullshit talk about my happiness being tantamount to your own, which is clearly a big fat lie, demanding the truth. And what for? People like you can't handle the truth, so why do you even ask? And what? You think you can rewrite reality or magically make my being gay go away by threatening the safety of the man I love? Really? Isn't it enough that you won't accept my being happy? Now you want to sabotage that too? My dad looked increasingly uncomfortable and sheepish with my every word. I think he thought he was going to have the upper hand in this confrontation, but now he was the one being shamed and scolded. Man to man, please, I scoffed sarcastically. Give me a fucking break. There's a whiny little child in this conversation throwing a temper tantrum because he can't have his way and it isn't me. At this point, I needed to get out of the apartment and put an end to this kabuki theater melodrama, so I bluntly said, "Right, Dad, you've said your piece. There's nothing more to talk about. We are done." And I let myself out. But I was shook for weeks afterwards because I genuinely believed that my dad might make good on his threats against James. As I said, he was too much of a wimp to do it himself, but I was terrified that he might send some of his goons to intimidate or hurt James. There were many paranoid, sleepless nights that followed our exchange when I would watch over James as he slept, all the while listening for any suspicious sounds of entry into our home. The townhouse we were living in at the time didn't have a garage, so James and I used to park our cars in the street. And in the evenings, after coming home from work, I would insist on meeting him at the curb when he arrived, under the pretense of wanting to help him with his files, all the while looking over his shoulder to see if any unsavory-looking characters were lurking about in the shadows. What kind of parent does this to their child? I kept thinking to myself. I mean, this was literally an act of terror committed by a parent against their own kid. I was appalled and sickened by my father. Thankfully, his repugnant threats proved to be little more than empty saber rattling, and no harm came to James. Perhaps my fiery pushback snapped my dad out of his trance-like state of deranged lunacy and stupidity. But just so there was no confusion or ambiguity after our infamous meeting, my dad saw fit to send me a very long letter, which I received a couple of weeks later, confirming that I was in fact disowned and dead to him, with more of his bullshit justifications for doing so once more. Oh, his cruel words and savage pronouncements were painfully etched into my memory, so I really didn't need reminding, but clearly he felt the need to put it in writing, to make it official, like a coroner's report or a death certificate. Very thoughtful. But for a dead guy, I felt fucking great. My career was scaling new heights, my relationship with James only deepened with every passing day, we traveled the world together, life was good. I felt so happy and in control of my life. There was, however, an unexpected casualty in all of this. So if you're watching this as a parent of an LGBTQ+ kid, please pay careful attention. As shocked and unprepared as you may be, if and when your kid comes out to you, please take pause, breathe, and choose your next words very carefully. The bar is so low for most of us that we'll probably forgive you for the cruel things you say to us, but there is a line that you can easily cross over to a point of no return or irreparable damage. If my dad had simply rejected me and cast me out, it would have been hurtful, but I would have respected him for his honesty and given him all the time and space he needed to process things, yet still left the door open for dialogue and reconciliation further down the line. But my dad's disrespect, arrogance, and fascistic, foolish miscalculation in thinking that I could be bullied into falling in line and somehow miraculously not being gay, not to mention his egregious threats against the man I loved, had destroyed whatever was left of my affection, fondness, and respect for him. When she heard about what had gone down between us, my mother urged me not to be so mad at my father, but what she didn't seem to understand was that after the dust had settled, I wasn't mad at all. Quite the contrary. Instead of being hot and bothered, I was now icy cold and detached. I'd left the relationship when he formally cut the cord and pronounced me dead. You see, if I'm pissed at you, it's actually a good sign because it means I'm still emotionally invested in our relationship. It's my indifference you really need to worry about because that's when I've left the building and you've lost me for good. I barely gave a moment's thought to my father in the year and a bit that passed before he tried to reach out to me again. It seems Daddy Dearest was having some trouble sticking to his tough guy resolve, and after weeks of me totally ghosting him, pun intended, and ignoring his calls and messages, he eventually asked my mom to smooth things over so he could have another go at being, you know, an actual decent parent. Look, it was a different time. Back then, we didn't know the things we know now. Some parents need time to process things and come around to their kid being LGBTQ+, so out of fairness and compassion, I offered my father a second chance and an opportunity to make amends and redeem himself. I was willing to give him points for his cap-in-hand outreach, but this time he was the one on trial, and my bar was set so super fucking high after the loathsome way he conducted himself. It took time. First he would ask how things were with you guys over the phone. Then he worked his way to actually saying James' name. And in the years that followed, my dad tried in his own half-hearted way to be okay with having a gay son. But he just couldn't help himself from making it painfully obvious that he was doing so most grudgingly. When he'd come to visit us at our home, he'd always give off this "woe is me, my son is gay" vibe, like he was stoically suffering through it all in silence. And I'm afraid that while I appreciated the initial gesture, the execution wasn't anywhere nearly good enough for me, because there's a world of difference between sufferance and acceptance. As I said, my bar is set high. I will welcome your love and acceptance, but I'll be damned if I'm going to be tolerated, especially in my own home, by a so-called loved one. Don't toss me crumbs, it's fucking insulting. In fact, I resented having my father's sulky, funereal energy in our happy home. I thought, no one's holding a gun to your head, Dad, so please spare yourself the suffering, but more importantly, spare me the suffering. If you can't or won't wholeheartedly embrace who I am and accept me in good faith, no problem. But don't come to my home and mope at my table while you mount your little passive-aggressive protest theater of performative disapproval like a black hole sucking all of the positive energy out of the room. Please just go. Our relationship limped along for a couple more years, but I eventually permanently severed ties and performed closure to my relationship with my dad, not just over his handling, or rather mishandling, of my being gay, but also because of the manner with which he treated my mother after they finally called it a day. Now, my mother had many shortcomings, but my dad's dishonorable conduct over the distribution of their joint finances, accrued over the 35-plus years she toiled beside him in all of his businesses, was a bridge too far for me. It seemed like the final betrayal of the caliber and class of gentleman he'd always claimed to be. When I wrote to him to appeal to his sense of fair play and offer him the opportunity to do the right thing by my mother, my dad responded with, "Only my God can judge me." Right. How nice for the judgy team, huh? They get to make high and mighty pronouncements about everybody else and put them through hell, but when it comes to their own moral culpability, they answer only to a higher power. How wonderfully convenient. Anyway, I ultimately forgave my dad, but I had not spoken to him for over 15 years prior to his death from a brain tumor. By then, he'd lost all cognitive function, so I'll never know if he wanted to see or say something to me before his passing. I wasn't there when he died, I didn't attend his funeral, and I saw no need to go. I'll never know if he did in fact disown me. I say that because I received mysterious documents from attorneys for me to sign, waiving any rights I had to his estate. I didn't bother engaging with any of it because I couldn't give a fuck, frankly. Studying my face for signs of grief after his passing, concerned people would often ask me if I was okay. And I tried somewhat futilely to help them understand that I had long since mourned the loss of a father. I'd already said my goodbyes. Pockets of memories and gratitude are all that remain. But cheer up, boys and girls. As sad as all of this might sound to some of you, I am totally at peace. And in a way, my dad actually gave me a wonderful final parting gift with his failure to embrace me. A deep and profound appreciation of the many intimate, beautiful father and son relationships I see all around me today. And many of those sons are gay, with wonderfully supportive dads and moms. I've watched videos of fathers proudly walking their gay sons down the aisle at their weddings and making heartfelt speeches and tributes, and I weep from pure, unadulterated joy. Like I said, I never thought that I would witness beautiful scenes like that in my lifetime, and it really warms my cold, black heart. Look, in the final analysis, my dad was simply a product of a different time and generation. He just did what his father did and his father before him. Plus, I'm not unsympathetic to his backstory. Like so many of his generation and ilk, my dad had been dealt a really tough hand in life, and I eventually came to see how it had made him so intractable, regimented, and joyless. And as a man who had surrendered his own agency and autonomy over his life choices to others out of a sense of duty and in an effort to please his family and community, it really shouldn't have surprised me that he would have expected me to fall on my sword. And I think that default tendency to appease his community or society at large made him captive to fears of what other people thought of him. Going back to those famous words I asked you to stick a pin in earlier, I think he gave away the game that fateful night of my coming out when he said, "How could you do this to us? How could you be so selfish? And how will I face people now that my son is a morphe?" It's as if he said the quiet part out loud. He wasn't directly asking it of me. I believe he was actually pondering the ramifications for himself. And in that moment, it immediately dawned on me. This is about you, isn't it? You're not a concerned, though ultimately misguided parent acting in what you think are my best interests. You're concerned about your own. You're worried about what my queer identity bodes for you. You're terrified that having a son who's gay will be a liability, a stain on your image, and a threat to your social and cultural standing, aren't you? And that's what I think it's really all about for a lot of families of queer children, especially, but not exclusively, within the Indian community. And brace yourself, kids, because I'm about to spitfire and get seriously based or drop a red pill, as your generation likes to say. So don't click on the next video if you're faint-hearted or easily offended.